All right, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into what is arguably the most staggering, the most profound, and deeply disturbing failure of medical ethics and human decency the world has ever cataloged. We're going to be exploring the operations of the Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731.
And we have to start by confronting the name itself. Officially, it was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. That bureaucratic title is, it's a masterpiece of deception. It's designed specifically to cloak an industrial-scale, sprawling engine of biological warfare. This wasn't a department of public health.
Right.
It was a factory, and it was dedicated with chilling efficiency to mass murder.
The numbers, right from the jump, they set the necessary gravity. We are dealing with systemic, state-sponsored terror here, not, isolated incidents. Historical estimates suggest that Unit 731 and its associated field branches were responsible for the deaths of anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 people. And that's through the wide-scale field dissemination of biological agents across occupied China. That figure is almost impossible to fully grasp.
It is. And yet, that count, as staggering as it is, represents the casualties outside the walls. Inside the Pingfang complex, the epicenter of this horror, the operation required a constant supply of human subjects. We're looking at a minimum of 3,000 individuals, men, women, children, who were murdered through lethal, methodical, and often agonizing experimentation.
They weren't even seen as victims. They were raw material.
Essential raw material. And that very concept, that phrase, brings us to the most dehumanizing element of the entire operation. To understand how highly educated, scientifically trained doctors and researchers could commit these atrocities, you have to acknowledge the mechanism of dissociation they employed.
Right. The psychological firewall.
Precisely. The victims, who were instantly stripped of their names, their identities, their rights, everything, were known to the staff by one infamous chilling term, Maruta.
Maruta, which is Japanese for logs. And as you've pointed out, this was far more than just a casual, cruel slur. This was a necessary psychological tool, wasn't it? It was deliberately enforced by the command structure.
It was absolutely fundamental to the entire project. Think about it. A human being evokes morality. A human being demands treatment, evokes empathy. A log is processed. By rebranding human beings as disposable logs, these highly skilled medical professionals could create this profound, protective separation between their actions and the moral reality of what they were doing.
So in their minds, they weren't committing murder.
They were simply processing raw material for the advancement of military science and, of course, for the glory of the empire.
And that is the absolute core of the moral collapse we're investigating here. Our mission in this deep dive is a forensic accounting of this systemic terror, exploring the horrifying machinery of the Pingfang complex and the cynical geopolitical bargain that ultimately protected its architects from justice after the war.
What's fundamentally shocking here, and what we need to keep coming back to, is a comprehensive inversion of the medical profession. We are not discussing poorly educated, coerced troops just following orders. These were aggressive, brilliant minds, the absolute cream of Japan's intellectual elite. Many were graduates of Kyoto and Tokyo Imperial Universities, the best of the best.
Healers.
Healers, yes. And the state apparatus mobilized its entire academic hierarchy to transform those healers into executioners, weaponizing plague, cholera, anthrax. This was a sophisticated industrial war crime, executed with meticulous academic rigor.
The sheer audacity of the entire project is just staggering, and I think to understand it, we have to start with the man who was the driving, fanatical force behind it all, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Ishii was a genuine paradox, wasn't he? He was known for being flamboyant, eccentric, prone to these wild parties and womanizing, yet underneath all of that was a man who was utterly consumed by his vision. He came from a wealthy, established, feudal family, had the highest academic credentials from Kyoto Imperial University. He wasn't some fringe madman.
No, not at all. He was a ferocious intellectual with a terrifying, absolute lack of ethical boundaries. And this combination allowed him to be a masterful, bureaucratic maneuverer. He secured essentially unlimited resources and funding for a project that, on its face, was just monstrous. He knew how to sell the threat. He knew how to play the game.
And his pivotal strategic realization, the genesis of this whole thing, came not in a lab, but during a 2-year tour of the West in the late 1920s. He was sent to study military science in Europe and America following World War I, but he kept circling back to one document in particular, the 1925 Geneva Protocol, the international ban on chemical and biological weapons.
Exactly. And most nations, at least publicly, viewed that ban as a necessary humanitarian ceiling, a line that shouldn't be crossed. Ishii, in this twisted strategic masterstroke, saw it as profound evidence of potential. His logic was coldly effective. If the major global powers feared biological weapons enough to formally outlaw them, then they must possess devastating game-changing potential.
So the ban itself was the proof of concept.
It was the ultimate advertisement for their power, and he concluded that Japan needed to acquire that power.
And this realization led directly to his core thesis, the one he sold tirelessly to the high command, the poor man's atomic bomb. He argued that biological warfare, or BW, was the ultimate strategic equalizer for Japan.
And again, you have to look at the context. They were a resource-poor nation. They lacked the heavy industry to compete with the U.S. or the USSR in a conventional drawn-out war. They knew that.
They couldn't win a war of attrition.
Never. But by weaponizing pathogens, a relatively inexpensive process rooted in microbiology, he argued they could achieve continental dominance without the massive, expensive industrial expenditure required for tanks, ships, and heavy artillery. This strategic framing was, in its cynicism, genius.
It's hard to argue with that cold logic if you have no morals.
And it secured him the unconditional support of the Japanese military hierarchy and the imperial system itself. They gave him everything he asked for.
And crucially, he masked this enormous offensive capability under that completely innocuous, almost boring cover story, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification designation.
It was brilliant misdirection. I mean, water purification was a legitimate, vital necessity for the Kwantung Army, operating in the often harsh and challenging environment of Manchuria.
Of course.
This allowed Ishii to build massive research complexes, move highly infectious pathogens freely, and transport thousands of personnel, all under a perfectly legitimate medical and sanitary pretext. Who questions a unit focused on preventing disease?
But underlying all of this technical and strategic cunning was a corrosive, dehumanizing ideology. This wasn't just a research project. It was an expression of virulent Japanese imperialism and racial supremacy.
Precisely. The system required it. The victims were primarily Chinese civilians, suspected communists, resistance fighters, Russians, Koreans, and later on, Allied POWs. And they were viewed explicitly through this lens of racial superiority, deemed as subhuman, expendable assets to be consumed for national glory. The Unit 731 enterprise simply could not operate unless the subjects were fundamentally regarded as non-people. There had to be a moral vacuum.
And this toxic blend of nationalism and careerism found its supply chain directly within the Japanese academic establishment. The level of complicity here is terrifying to contemplate.
It really is. Universities weren't just passively aware, they actively sent their most promising students, elite physicians, virologists, researchers, to Manchuria for what they called field
A
experience.
sort of grotesque internship.
The academic infrastructure of Japan became an active feeder system for the death camps. Imagine the career pressure. The fastest route to academic advancement, the best grants, the most prestigious professorships, was gaining experience at a facility where ethical considerations were entirely suspended.
It created a profound systemic corruption where scientific ambition was inextricably linked to murderous national loyalty.
And they were sold on the idea that they were doing necessary, cutting-edge science that no other nation dared to attempt. They were pioneers.
That ambition manifested itself physically in the Pingfang complex, located just outside Harbin in what was then Manchukuo. Around 1936, the Imperial Army forcibly cleared 144 acres of land, displacing entire local villages to build this absolute fortress of concrete and steel.
And it was deliberately designed not as a mere hospital or a laboratory, but as a self-sufficient, impenetrable city unto itself. The architecture perfectly reflected the moral schizophrenia of the operation.
What do you mean by that?
Well, you had these pristine administrative buildings, comfortable staff, recreational facilities, a library, even a Shinto shrine, and a school for the children of the staff. All of it existed in this manicured, normal-looking bubble, sitting directly on top of the operational zones of horror.
The sheer industrial capacity is what sets this apart from so many other wartime atrocities. The laboratories weren't makeshift shacks. They were equipped with state-of-the-art medical technology for the time. We're talking about massive rooms filled with thousands of incubators, designed not just for growing bacterial cultures, but crucially for the mass breeding of biological vectors.
Fleas and rats, millions of them. The output metrics are what really solidify its identity as a war machine. Records show the Pingfang facility could produce upwards of 30 kilograms of bubonic plague bacteria in just a few days.
30 kilograms.
This was not small-scale academic research. This was the mass production of weapons of annihilation.
And the real secret, the dark heart of the complex, was the special prison, known internally as the Row and Ha buildings. This facility was hidden within the main complex, completely invisible to outsiders, and it was designed specifically to hold up to 600 Marutas at any given time, housed in conditions that were squalid beyond imagining.
Witness accounts later confirmed that the architecture itself was engineered for secrecy and silence. The walls were heavily insulated. The design was intended to deliberately muffle the sounds of torture and experimentation.
So the screams of the victims were literally swallowed by the concrete.
Yes, hidden beneath the mundane daily routine of the surrounding administrative workers and their families.
And the grim, pervasive constant that defined the Pingfang skyline was the smoke. There were 3 massive incinerators that operated day and night, burning the remains of the victims. The outside cover story for this constant smoke, a lumber mill. The cynicism is almost unbearable. They called the prisoners logs and disguised the disposal of their remains as the burning of wood.
The management of the human supply chain was meticulously systematized. The process was called special transfer, or tokubetsu iso. Victims, typically arrested by the Kenpeikai, the notoriously brutal military police, were designated for Unit 731 instead of being processed through regular prisons or military trials.
They just vanished from the system.
They simply vanished. They lost not only their freedom, but their entire legal identity. They were transported to Pingfang in these black-painted windowless trucks, ensuring they were invisible to the public until they were literally swallowed by the facility's gates. And once inside, they were reduced to numbers. They were logs.
And we cannot overlook the deeply disturbing role of the youth corps in the staffing of this facility. These were teenagers, some as young as 14 or 15, recruited directly from Japan and put through this rigorous indoctrination process specifically designed to desensitize them to the horror they would be assisting in.
It was psychological conditioning of the highest order. Former Youth Corps member Hideo Shimizu later recounted how pervasive it was. He described being shown specimens of human body parts, hearts, lungs, intestines preserved in jars, and being explicitly taught to view the enemies of Japan as subhuman. This was not subtle training. This was preparation for assisting in genocide.
That these young boys were tasked with the most grim jobs imaginable.
Handling the infected rats and fleas, maintaining the laboratories, cleaning up, and eventually assisting the senior doctors in the final disposal of the bodies. The unit essentially ensured a steady, loyal supply of subordinates who were corrupted at a formative age, trained to view this industrialized murder as simply part of their national duty.
Okay, so moving from the architecture of this horror to the reality inside its walls, we have to confront what the doctors were actually doing. The experiments themselves were defined by an absolute scientific rigor applied to active, sustained torture. The goal was always twofold: develop superior biological weapons and determine the absolute physiological limits of the human body.
The language they used in their notes was clinical pathogen injection protocols, hypobaric pressure assessments, but this was just a thin veneer over sadism. The research demanded that victims be pushed past every conceivable human limit, often dying only when a doctor had extracted the last possible piece of data.
Let's start with the most notorious practice, the one that defines the unit's name in history: vivisection, the surgical dissection of a living human being. This practice was frequent, methodical, and chillingly, most often performed without any form of anesthesia.
And the rationale for denying anesthesia is perhaps the most sickening technical detail of the entire operation. The doctors argued that anesthetic drugs might taint the data, that they might alter the body's natural physiological responses to the lethal diseases being studied: plague, cholera, anthrax, you name it.
So to get the purest data.
To get the purest, most accurate reading of disease progression, the subject had to be fully conscious and suffering.
Victims, often already weakened by whatever disease they'd been infected with, would be tied down on a table and systematically cut open. Doctors would observe the disease progressing on the internal organs in real time before post-mortem decomposition could interfere with their data. They were charting the exact moment of organ failure in a living patient.
It's almost impossible to picture. They systematically removed organs: the stomach, the spleen, the liver, the lungs, and finally the heart, one by one, while the victim remained sentient and, in many cases, screaming. They were charting blood flow, documenting the exact physical changes caused by pathogens on living, circulating tissue. And this unimaginable fate extended even to pregnant women.
Women who were sometimes impregnated through rape by the guards.
Yes, specifically so. The doctors could study the vertical transmission of diseases like syphilis directly to the fetus. No one was spared.
The final, brutal outcome of a vivisection was always the same. No subject ever survived. Once the doctors had finished their useful observations, the victim was killed, and their remains were instantly taken to be incinerated. It was a calculated, industrialized form of scientific murder, repeated thousands of times over.
Shifting focus now, but to no less of a horror, we have to look at the crucial frostbite experiments. These were led by a physiologist named Yoshimura Hisato. Japan was anticipating a massive war with the Soviet Union in the frigid northern territories, so research on surviving extreme cold was a top military priority.
And the procedures designed to gather this data were, they were characterized by a staggering degree of specialized cruelty. Prisoners were taken outside in the middle of the harsh Manchurian winter or placed in freezing chambers. Their limbs were doused with water and just exposed until they froze completely solid. Witnesses later testified to hearing doctors striking the frozen limbs with a cane.
And it producing a clear, horrifying sound like hitting a plank of wood.
Exactly.
And once that necessary level of freezing was achieved, Yoshimura would then meticulously test various, often torturous, methods of thawing. He'd precisely document the pain, the tissue death, the point of permanent damage. These methods included dousing the limbs in scalding hot water, holding them directly over open fires, or sometimes just leaving them untreated to document the progression of gangrene and necrosis until the limb was entirely unusable.
And here lies a truly profound and disturbing legacy. It's a paradox that speaks volumes about the value assigned to the data versus the human cost. Through these systematic torture sessions, Yoshimura determined that the most effective treatment for deep frostbite was immersion in water heated to a very precise range, 100 to 122 degrees Fahrenheit.
And that finding, bought with the agony and the lives of countless human beings, was published in medical journals after the war. It remains a documented standard of care in medical texts today, often entirely disconnected from its horrific origin in Pingfeng.
So the data survived.
The data survived, the victims did not. And those victims who did survive the initial frostbite tests often had their necrotic limbs amputated, only to be immediately recycled into other experimental programs, weapons testing, disease inoculation, until they were physically unable to provide any more data whatsoever.
Of course, the core mission was always the development of lethal biological weapons. This necessitated extensive pathogen and transmission studies, with prisoners essentially serving as living test tubes. They were inoculated with hyperlethal strains of bubonic plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, smallpox, and syphilis.
The researchers were pathologically meticulous. They documented every single symptom. The precise onset of fever, the severity of vomiting, the rate of lymph node swelling, the exact timeline of organ failure. But they weren't just studying the effects, they were studying the contagion itself. They placed infected prisoners in shared cells with healthy ones to precisely calculate the rate of spread via contact, shared food, or coughing.
Data that was absolutely crucial for planning effective biological attacks on dense urban centers.
Exactly. They were building a manual for biological warfare.
And the cruelty went even further, into the realm of reproductive horror. As we mentioned, women were subjected to systematic rape, unforced pregnancy, specifically to study the vertical transmission of diseases, like syphilis, to the developing fetus. The resulting babies were then also used in these horrific experimental studies before being killed.
And if we look at the unit's preparation for all facets of warfare, we find the chilling pressure chamber experiments. These were conducted specifically for high-altitude warfare preparation, to determine the physiological limits Japanese pilots might face. Prisoners were sealed into hypobaric chambers where the air pressure was slowly, agonizingly reduced to simulate extreme altitude.
The horror of these sessions is almost unimaginable, as confirmed by witness testimony presented decades later. As the pressure was methodically lowered, the victims' bodies reacted violently, catastrophically. Witnesses confirmed that the victims' eyes would literally pop from their sockets, and their intestines were forced out of their bodies due to the immense pressure differential.
The subjects died in excruciating agony from massive internal organ rupture. All while the doctors stood by, charting the exact pressure level at which human life failed without protective gear. The goal was to provide data on survival limits by torturing civilians to death. The grotesque visual horror of the body deforming under pressure was often too much even for the corrupted observers, leaving deep psychological trauma.
And finally, the Marutas were used as living, disposable targets for conventional weapons testing as well. For regular ordnance, prisoners were tied to stakes at varying distances across the test fields. Soldiers would then detonate grenades or unleash flamethrowers to precisely test the effective kill radius and analyze the resulting wound patterns on the human body.
But for biological dissemination, Ishii's key innovation was something called the ceramic Uji bomb. This was a critical technological advance. Metal casings, upon detonation, generated too much heat, which invariably killed the sensitive bacteria before they could disperse effectively.
So the explosion itself was counterproductive.
Right. Ishii's ceramic bomb was designed to shatter cleanly at a low altitude, dispersing pathogen-laden dust or, most importantly, infected fleas without that thermal destruction. It ensured the microbes survived and dispersed effectively.
And these ceramic horrors were tested on human targets. Prisoners were tied down in open fields, like at the notorious Onda test site, specifically to measure the effective infection and dispersion rates of this specialized biological hardware. They wanted quantitative, hard data on how many people would die per bomb drop.
And that successful lab work, that successful field testing, it transitioned immediately into active, industrialized biological warfare. Entire cities in China were turned into mass casualty field tests. This was not a theoretical threat anymore. It was a deadly, invisible war.
The key technical hurdle which Ishii successfully overcame was efficiency and survival of the pathogen. Simply dropping bacterial aerosols from planes was inefficient because the microbes were quickly killed by sunlight and other harsh environmental conditions.
So Ishii's ultimate solution was brilliant in its absolute horror. The biological vector, the plague-infected flea.
And Pingfang was equipped to handle this vector on an insane scale. The facility had these vast incubation rooms dedicated solely to breeding millions upon millions of fleas, which were then deliberately infected with Yersinia pestis, the bubonic plague bacteria. This ensured not just the survival, but the wide and effective dissemination of the lethal agent deep into civilian populations.
This engineered vector paved the way for the major aerial attacks. One of the first large-scale assaults was on the city of Ningbo in 1940. Planes dropped the ceramic bombs containing these infected fleas, triggering a devastating plague epidemic that resulted in the deaths of over 1,500 people. The target areas became these invisible zones of contagion and terror.
And similar operations followed. The bombing of Chung in 1941, where aerial spraying and flea bombing operations led to plague outbreaks that killed thousands more. Testimonies confirmed that Unit 731 members were on the planes, airdropping these contaminated vectors, overwhelming the local Chinese medical infrastructure, which was entirely unprepared for such advanced biological attacks.
But perhaps the most malicious and systemically heinous attack was the Baoshan cholera catastrophe in May of 1942. This was a coordinated, multifaceted assault designed for maximum lethality. It wasn't just an aerial drop. It combined multiple dissemination techniques simultaneously.
That's right. Planes dropped ceramic bombs, this time releasing swarms of infectious flies over the city, while ground teams, some disguised as sanitation crews, simultaneously poisoned the city's fundamental resources.
They systematically dumped cholera and typhoid bacteria into essential water sources, into wells, into reservoirs. This combination of aerial dispersal of flies and ground contamination of drinking water led to an enormous catastrophic epidemic. Casualty estimates for Baoshan range wildly, which reflects the chaos at the time, but they reach upwards of 10,000 to over 200,000 people. It's just a horrifying number.
A survivor, Zuo Yongquan, later gave this harrowing testimony about watching his entire family succumb to the epidemic, leaving him an orphan.
And if we summarize the dissemination techniques, we see this pattern of malicious innovation designed to exploit civilian desperation. They used aerial spraying, yes, but they also contaminated food supplies, specifically easily handled items like melons and cantaloupes and clothing, distributing them to unsuspecting, often starving villagers to maximize the spread of typhoid and cholera.
They weaponized hunger.
They weaponized everything.
The final tally remains crucial for our understanding of the scope of this crime. The biological warfare activities conducted by Unit 731 and its sister units across China caused an estimated 200,000 to 500,000 deaths. And we need to be crystal clear here. These were not combat casualties. This was the calculated mass murder of civilian populations using highly sophisticated, industrialized weapons of mass destruction.
And then the end came. As the tide of World War II turned definitively against Japan and the Soviet Union launched the massive August Storm Offensive into Manchuria in August 1945, Unit 731 went into a frantic, immediate emergency liquidation mode.
Their priority was singular and absolute: the destruction of all evidence, physical, human, and documentary. The existence of this program was a state secret that could not fall into Allied hands, especially not those of the advancing Soviets.
The destruction of the complex was absolute. The remaining 3,000 Maruta still within the facility were immediately gassed or shot. The order was simple: kill all remaining witnesses to obliterate the history of the unit. Their bodies were incinerated in the 3 furnaces or, in a rush, just dumped into the Songwo River to hide the incomprehensible scale of the massacre.
And then the buildings themselves.
The massive, complex concrete structures built to withstand bombardment was systematically leveled using immense amounts of TNT, reducing Pingfang to rubble.
Ishii and his top officers fled back to Japan in the chaos, but they carried their most valuable, non-negotiable asset with them: the data. Thousands of pages of research notes, microfilm, and detailed slides documenting the entire spectrum of human experimentation. This data was their insurance policy. It was their currency for survival.
And that brings us to the ultimate, cynical moment of geopolitical complicity. In the immediate post-war environment, U.S. priorities shifted radically. As the Cold War rapidly intensified and the rivalry with the Soviet Union became the central global concern, the pursuit of justice was brutally sacrificed for strategic advantage.
The calculus changed.
It changed overnight.
U.S. intelligence officers, specifically a man named Lt. Colonel Murray Sanders, were dispatched, and they quickly recognized what they called the inestimable value of the Unit 731 research. This was scientific information detailed, physiological responses to anthrax, plague, other BW agents, including their efficacy in cold climates, that was simply unobtainable in the U.S.
And why was it unobtainable? Because obtaining it required systematic human experimentation, which was strictly prohibited by ethical and legal restrictions in the United States. The Pingfang data represented a horrifying shortcut. It was a complete map of biological warfare effects on humans, purchased with the lives of thousands of victims.
So the secret, cynical bargain was struck, and it was authorized at the highest levels of the U.S. military. Shiro Ishii and his key subordinates were granted full immunity from prosecution at the upcoming Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in exchange for the complete, exclusive handover of their research. Military knowledge was prioritized over moral accountability and international law.
The price of silence was exorbitant, yet it was easily covered up. The U.S. ensured that all evidence regarding Unit 731's atrocities was suppressed. The official narrative of the Tokyo trials entirely ignored the biological warfare program. The suffering of hundreds of thousands of Chinese civilians and Allied POWs was effectively erased from the legal record to protect the strategic data acquisition.
And they didn't just give them a pass, they paid them.
They paid them. To ensure the cooperation and perpetual silence of these war criminals, the U.S. provided financial incentives. Stipends, totaling between 150,000 and 200,000 yen, were paid to former members of the unit. This financial corruption just cemented the moral bankruptcy of the entire exchange.
This deal, it goes beyond the cynicism of something like Operation Paperclip, where the U.S. recruited Nazi rocket scientists. Here, they were not just acquiring talent, they were actively purchasing biological warfare data derived directly from the torture and mass murder of civilians and Allied prisoners, and then actively suppressing the legal evidence of those crimes.
And it is absolutely essential to contrast this total U.S. suppression with the Soviet response. The USSR had managed to capture 12 former Unit 731 members who hadn't escaped the rush out of Manchuria. These individuals were put on trial in a city called Khabarovsk in 1949.
And these trials, which were largely ignored in the West at the time, offered the world the first detailed public glimpse into the true extent of the Pingfang horrors. Major General Kiyoshi Kawashima testified openly about the atrocities, confirming the existence of the pressure chamber experiments and the use of the plague-infected flea bombs in cities. All 12 defendants were found guilty and sentenced to labor camps.
Yet the Western powers, committed to maintaining the cover-up and consumed by the intense anti-communist fervor of the burgeoning Cold War, largely dismissed the Khabarovsk trials as Soviet propaganda. The detailed, verifiable confessions were ignored, and the truth remained officially suppressed for decades until declassified U.S. documents finally proved the Soviets had been telling the uncomfortable truth all along.
So, the failure to prosecute these criminals had profound, systemic, and lasting consequences for post-war Japanese society and institutions. Unlike their Nazi counterparts, the alumni of Unit 731 were not made pariahs. They simply returned home, integrated seamlessly, and rose to positions of extraordinary power and prestige.
This network, forged in secrecy and fueled by absolute ambition, remained intact. Historians often refer to it as a medical mafia. These men took the ethos they perfected in Pingfang institutional protection, prioritizing data above human life and zero accountability, and transplanted it directly into Japanese academia and, significantly, industry.
The most immediate and tragic link is to the pharmaceutical industry, specifically the Green Cross Corporation. Masaji Kitano, who served as the second commander of Unit 731, became a director of this major Japanese pharmaceutical giant almost immediately after the war.
And he wasn't alone. Ryoichi Naito, another key figure in Unit 731 who served as the crucial liaison during the immunity negotiations with U.S. intelligence, went on to become a co-founder of the Green Cross Corporation. So the men who ran the death camp were literally placed in charge of Japan's leading pharmaceutical sector.
And the horrifying, tragic echo of the Ping Fang ethos resurfaced decades later. The Green Cross Corporation was at the very epicenter of the devastating HIV-tainted blood scandal in Japan during the 1980s. Despite clear evidence and international warnings, they continued to sell unheated blood products known to be contaminated with HIV.
This negligence resulted in the infection and subsequent death of thousands of Japanese hemophiliacs. It is an appalling, clear-cut line tracing from the war crimes to corporate malpractice.
The corporate culture that prioritized institutional protection, absolute secrecy, and profit over patient safety.
It's the exact same ethos. The analysis is damning. The men who had treated Chinese civilians as disposable logs applied that same callous disregard, that same willingness to accept massive human collateral damage in the pursuit of institutional survival and profit to their own Japanese patients decades later. The moral vacuum persisted.
And beyond the Green Cross, other members also achieved absurd heights of prestige, showcasing the complete ethical whitewash. Dr. Yoshimura Hisato, the physiologist who oversaw the horrific frostbite torture sessions, the man who gained his data from those unspeakable acts, became a revered professor and later the president of the Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine.
And not only that, he was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun, one of Japan's highest civilian honors, for his contributions to science. It is a chilling testament to how completely their systemic crimes were absorbed and celebrated by the post-war Japanese establishment. For decades, the medical landscape was led by men who had systematically violated every fundamental tenet of their profession, shielded entirely by that powerful, high-level geopolitical bargain.
Ultimately, as we close this deep dive, the most painful and lasting insights come from the rare few perpetrators who later found the strength, or maybe the compulsion, to confess. Their internal testimonies utterly dismantle the hollow defense of simply following orders.
Ken Yuasa, a former army doctor who confessed years later, he detailed the terrifying speed with which the horror became normalized. He stated that he was profoundly afraid and shaken during his very first vivisection, but that, and I'm quoting, "the second time around it was much easier. By the third time I was willing to do it."
He spoke extensively about the crushing burden of conscience, but admitted that in the moment, the pervasive intense nationalism and the ideological pressure were strong enough to override basic human decency. They genuinely believed they were conducting righteous, necessary work for the empire.
And we also have the incredibly visceral testimony of the Youth Corps members. Yoshio Shinazuka, who spent decades trying to atone, admitted to washing the bodies of victims before dissection. He recalled the terror etched on the faces of the Maruta and the constant acrid stench from the 3 incinerators. He later stated, "I have committed a sin that can never be forgiven."
Most recently, and perhaps most hauntingly, in 2024, Hideo Shimizu, another former Youth Corps member, returned to the preserved site of the Harbin facility to offer an apology. He described the jars of human specimens and the hell on earth that was Unit 731. His testimony serves as one of the final living links, a direct, visceral reminder that this is not distant history. This is a living, festering memory for East Asia.
The story of Unit 731 is a profound stain. It demonstrates the horrifying speed and efficiency with which science can utterly disintegrate when it is divorced from ethics and placed under the absolute pressure of nationalist fervor. The systemic nature of the operation exposes the cold, pragmatic calculus of geopolitics, where mass murder was systematically traded for scientific knowledge.
The victims, the Maruta, were denied their lives, their names, and for decades their history. The physical evidence was meticulously burned or buried, and the legal evidence was suppressed by a global superpower.
But the scientific legacy persists. That data, bought with the currency of silence and mass graves, still exists. It lingers in unacknowledged citations, like those precise frostbite treatment parameters we discussed. The geopolitical scar remains an open wound and a flashpoint in East Asia because the victims were never afforded justice, acknowledgement, or closure.
So what does this all mean for modern bioethics? What is the enduring question we are left with after confronting this history?
This is the final essential provocation. What does it truly mean for the integrity of scientific research, for the morality of nations, and for a global commitment to human rights. When the detailed, meticulously recorded data documenting the systematic torture and murder of thousands of people was deemed by a global superpower to be of inestimable value, bought and paid for in the absolute corruption of the human soul. The poor man's atomic bomb proved its cost was measured not in industrial capacity, but in the total terrifying obliteration of moral integrity. That, more than any statistic, is the haunting legacy of Ping Fang.